So here's a brief agenda of what we're going through. It's going to be some of the history of the National Flood Insurance Program, or sort of why we're doing what we're doing, but then also the specifics of what the study was here. This is and I'm going to try and go through this as quickly as possible. There's a lot of information, but a lot of it is just sort of generally what and why, and again, the specifics are out in the room with the experts. But here's an idea of flooding. Flooding is the most damaging of the natural hazards, and there's a huge impact on property. And so you can see, you know, anyway, this is what we're dealing with, is these economic losses from flood throughout the nation. And this is specific to Washington State. You see the big years of 96, 2006. These were massive floods with a huge amount of damages. So here is specific to Snohomish County. You can see in excess of 20 million. These are very large numbers, very large potential property at risk. And so what we are trying to do with the National Flood Insurance Program is quantify the risk and provide opportunities for insurance for people at risk. Here is these are flood insurance claims. These are people that had flood insurance, that had flood damages, and have filed for reimbursement through the flood insurance program since 1977. So again, very large numbers in certain higher risk areas. Snohomish County, of course, would be the unincorporated parts of the county. All of the incorporated cities have their own numbers. So the National Flood Insurance Program, essentially when your homeowner's insurance, and at one point homeowner's insurance covered flood losses, then the homeowner's insurance, they figured out that they couldn't quantify the specific loss, they couldn't amortize that risk accurately without the analysis to determine what the risk is. And when homeowners insurance stopped covering flood insurance because they couldn't come up with an accurate risk, the federal government decided to take over with the National Flood Insurance Program to quantify the risk and to provide insurance. But through that program, to be a member of the National Flood Insurance Program, you have to enact an ordinance that reduces the risk, and that's what promoting the floodplain management practices refers to. There is a mandatory purchase requirement if you're in a special flood hazard area, and that is one of the more impactful pieces of this program is this mandatory purchase requirement. If your home is located in a special flood hazard area and you have a mortgage, your mortgage provider will require you to carry flood insurance. And your flood insurance rates is based on the flood insurance rate map, which is ultimately how the flood studies end up being displayed to the public. But this again is the details of that mandatory purchase requirement. So what we're talking about is the 1% annual chance event, or the 100-year flood. They've, within the last 10 years or so, changed the terminology from 100-year to 1% annual chance, just to remove that impression that it's only going to happen once every 100 years. It has a 1% chance of happening every year. And so that year, even if it happened last year, it could happen again next year. But statistically, it's happening once every 100 years, or 1% annual chance. What we are determining in these studies is the floodplain extent and the base flood elevation. So the floodplain ends where the base flood elevation runs into the ground, is essentially how this works. So the NFIP, again, is mapping, regulations, and insurance. So what we're talking about today is mostly the mapping. That's what the new study is changing. But then the regulations are building permits and the other regulations that they can talk about at the table back there that are impacted by the new flood study and the new base flood elevations. And then the insurance providing. So it enables people in any flood zone to purchase insurance, but the requirement for purchase is just within that 1% annual chance. So this is the entire Snohomish County. We didn't update every river, but I'm going to get into the specifics of what we updated. But this is everything is now in a digital format. Previously, The effective maps, the regulatory maps were just the paper maps. And now as everything moves to a more digital platform, it's much easier to identify and locate things, obviously on a digital format. So one of the big changes here, just so that people are aware, is a datum shift. And that's from NGVD29 to NAVD88, and none of that really matters, but basically where they define the zero level has shifted by between 3.6 and 3.9 feet. Essentially, the NGVD29 was based on average tidal elevations, and they realized it's hard to determine an elevation based on the tides if you're in the middle of the country, far from the ocean. And so they have a much more accurate way of determining where zero is now. The water still runs downhill, it's just we've changed where that zero line is. So there's going to be several areas where, mood lighting, that's better, thank you. There'll be several areas where we haven't actually changed the base flood elevation, but it will look like that base flood elevation is almost 4 feet higher. And that's a result of the datum shift and not a result of a new study. So just keep that in mind if you're comparing the old maps versus the new maps. And they should be able to compare apples for apples to you at the back tables. But just bear in mind that there is that shift from NGVD29 to NAVD88. And again, the conversion is different based on where you are, and that's why there's a range in conversion. In some counties, it is the same number throughout the county. Here, it's going to be shifted reach by reach on different streams based on where you are geographically located. But here's just a demonstration. So if your flood is on your house at a BFE of 2 foot, NGVD29, it's now a BFE of 5.8 feet, but it's the same elevation. So just to be clear, if there's no change in the BFE, there might still be a change in what that physical elevation reads. So here is, as part of the shift to a digital platform, along with, there still are paper maps available, but there's what's called a DFIRM database, the Digital Flood Insurance Rate Map database that has all of these different layers. One of those layers is the base flood elevations, one of those layers is the geometry, the polygons that show the flood extents, but so all of this is contained within this DFIRM database, and that's how the data is now available. So previously you would have had these individual maps and it was very difficult to locate the physical property address relative to the flood zone. Now it's much easier to overlay it on aerial photos, on parcel lines, and to more discreetly locate the structure, because it's the structure that you're insuring, not the property. The property can get wet. It's just the structure that is vital here. So, again, not every stream is updated, but as part of this study, we have a new coastal study for the Puget Sound coastline in Snohomish County, but then also what you see here. So SKYKOMISH River, North and South Forks, Snoqualmie River, Sultan River, the Snohomish River has been updated. The redelineation, that second point, is a zone AE is a detailed study where we've done a very detailed study based on the ground survey. I'll get to some of those details in a minute. But we know the elevation of the flood zone, and we have much better updated topography, so we've redrawn the flood limits in those areas to meet the new, the updated topography. So the elevation hasn't changed, but the physical footprint of that floodplain may have changed based on the topography. It's much more accurate topography now. There was also a major letter of map revision on the Pilchuck River, and that's been added. That was already effective. It's just now more easy to be seen on the updated mapping. The floodway, so there's the floodplain. Again, as I said, the base flood elevation is calculated everywhere. The floodplain is where the base flood elevation ties into high ground. The floodplain, we have what's called the floodplain fringe, and then there's the floodway. The floodway is intended to represent the deepest and fastest water moving. If you think about it, if you started filling in the floodplain, at some point you're going to constrict, you're removing storage from the system, and you're constricting the channel and potentially impacting the base flood elevation and potentially damaging your neighbors. So the idea of the floodway is to preserve the conveyance of the stream and restrict development in that, again, the deepest and fastest moving part of the channel. So the way that's calculated is internal to the model. We have a computer model for all of these rivers that models the hydrology and hydraulics. The hydrology is how much, how often, how much water you're dealing with, and what the frequency is. The hydraulics is how deep, how fast. It's what that river's physically doing as it moves through. So as you constrict the channel and build these sort of hypothetical encroachments, you're going to impact the water surface elevation, and you squeeze the channel in until you've pushed the water up by 1 foot. And we've determined that 1 foot is a good, you're potentially raising, if you were to fill in the entire floodplain fringe, basically everything that's not the floodway, you would theoretically get about a 1 foot rise everywhere. And that's been determined as a reasonable amount of damage, or a reasonable, an allowable modification. So the floodway, development within the floodway, fill within the floodway is much more difficult than in the floodplain fringe, so the outside the floodway. And that's just basically how a floodway is derived. And you're removing equal conveyance on each side, and it's a modeling exercise that determines a floodplain fringe. And again, it's just not to exceed 1 foot. So, I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. If I go too fast, please stop me, but there's a lot of details that, these are the specifics on the Upper SKYKOMISH, on what was studied and when. This was through a cooperating technical partnership with the county. And many of these studies are done in 2006 to 2010 range. And I'll get to why we're rolling out now. And this was previously released in 2010, so you may have seen this before. There's been slight changes, and I'll get into that too. So here's a map generally of the Upper SKYKOMISH study area from here upstream. New topographic data, so LIDAR is, generally most of the new topography is with LIDAR based, and this is physically an aircraft flying overhead, shooting lasers, and timing the return of these laser beams, and you get high returns at the top of trees, tops of bushes, and low returns from the ground. You weed out the high returns, you cut out all the structures, and you're left with bare earth terrain, and it's very accurate, and it's also verified with blind, on-the-ground physical survey. You end up with a very good product, and that's what we're using as the basis of much of the mapping. However, LIDAR can't see through the water, so for a detailed study, for a Zone AE study, bridges are very impactful on your flood elevations, and obviously the amount of conveyance you have below wherever the water was the day the LIDAR was flown is important. So we're sending out physical survey crews in boats with waders, and they're measuring how deep the water is and logging that and measuring elevations. So you can see on this, the figure in the upper right is the LIDAR shows, the LIDAR stops at the water, and then the survey fills in underwater. So that's where you're getting the underwater, that the bathymetry is from the on-the-ground survey. And that you'll have that everywhere that you have a Zone AE study, you have that kind of detail. So the hydrology, again, that's how much water you're dealing with, how often. The hydrology is mostly based on gauge analysis. All of these rivers have gauges, mostly operated by the USGS. And we look at the full period of record. In most cases, we're looking at over 60 years of record. We have very good record in this area. And you're looking at the annual maximum events and doing a statistical analysis to determine your 100-year, your 1% annual chance peak flow rate. Or in some cases, you're routing the entire flood through, which, so you're having, it's a two-dimensional, or it's not a two-dimensional, it's a unsteady model that will route the entire flood through the system. So the flood rises, peaks, and then falls as it moves through the system. And that's all based on statistical analysis of the gauges. So, slight differences in how the hydrology was done through here, but all based on gauge analysis, with the exception of May Creek, which is based on regression. And regression is an equation that looks at watersheds that have gauges on them and comes up with ways of extrapolating the peak flow rates based on land use, based on impervious cover, based on watershed size and slope. So you can look at what a similar watershed is producing from a similar amount of rain and determine the peak runoff for your specific watershed based on those regression analysis. So it's indirectly based on gauges. But the hydraulic method is all HECRAS. HECRAS is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers program that hasn't changed much in a long time. It's mostly balancing energy as you move through the system. It's a step backwater model, so it's calculating a water surface elevation at the downstream end and then marching upstream, and you're inputting everything from, it's calculating energy losses. So it has the channel slope, it has roughness coefficients, it has distances, and as the water moves through, it can calculate your velocity and your water depth as it moves through your system. And so, and we are trying to validate it in any way we can based on observed data. So we're looking, again, we're modeling this 1% annual chance flood, which is a statistically based flood, but we can use that model and compare it with actual measured events and make sure that the model's producing base flood elevations for the measured events that match what was observed. And so that's what we're looking at. We have high water marks from 2006 and 2008. And again, for much of this area, that 2006 flood is the flood of record. And so a lot of the changes are based on that flood and how it impacted the period of record. So again, remember, you're looking at the maximum events for the entire period of record. So if you get a very high flood, that could skew the statistics upward. If you get a long period of very low flooding, that could skew the statistics downward for that peak flow. In this case, though, it did go up since the 2006 was so big. But HECRAS is used for really everything you're seeing here, including the floodway. So the lower SKYKOMISH, Snoqualmie River flood study, this included some areas of King County. These are the details, again, a detailed study using HECRAS, using gauge analysis for the hydrology, and a very large study. Here's a map showing the general extent of that study. So redelineation, again, so 183 miles of Snohomish County were redelineated. These are areas where we had detailed mapping available, but the old mapping was based on probably 20-foot contours and just not very high resolution. So the intent was to get a better view of that map by placing it on more detailed topography. And so that was done for all of these listed rivers, again, 183 river miles. Here's a graphical demonstration of what that delineation can look like. And so, again, much of the mapping, so remember we have on-the-ground survey, any zone AE study, any detailed study has the survey to calculate that models the bridges and models the bathymetry. So really, the floodplain extents are still based on the overbank topography, and that's what you historically would have gotten from the USGS quad maps, likely something, 10 to 20 foot contours, not very high resolution. We now have much greater detail in the overbanks. So when we take the old maps and the old BFEs, we realize they don't match perfectly with the overbank topography, except that we know the models are still good because they were surveyed by hand. So we can now take those base flood elevations and redraw them. And so you're seeing, in many cases, the regulations are still tied to the elevation. So even though you see a footprint change, the floodplain changings, it doesn't necessarily change the effective impact as much. But you can see in this example, the blue line represents where it would have been based on the USGS quad maps, and the pink fill is where it is based on the new topography. So you can see, you can expect slight shifts like that due to redelineation. So here is the Snohomish River restudy, and just generally where that was. Again, we can get into details back at the engineering table or over at the property ID table if you're more interested in specifically what changed in this location. The big thing that changed here, though, So these maps were released in 2010 with the exception of the new coastal study. Most of this data was released in 2010, but then the new levee analysis and mapping program changed things, and so this study was put on hold until the LAMP process, because everything in FEMA has an acronym, until LAMP was more clarified. And so historically, where do I start? So levees could be anything, right? A levee could be a pile of dirt that someone had historically pushed up to level a field for agricultural purposes, and it could provide some protection. But what we're looking at here again is that 1% annual chance flood. And to be a line on the map, to show protection on the flood insurance rate map, we have to show that this was designed as a flood control structure, that it's hydraulically significant, that it has an owner, that it's operated, and that it can be certified that it was designed to meet the 1% annual chance flood. So you're looking at the top of levee versus the base flood elevation. You need a certain amount of freeboard. It's a pretty strict and stringent process to certify a levee. It is non-trivial. So to be a line on the map to show protection, we need confidence that there's engineering backing up this levee and that we can be confident that it can perform relative to that 1% annual chance flood. But historically, if something was certified, it was a line on the map, it was the edge of the floodplain, with the exception, of course, of interior drainage, which is all the flooding that backs up behind the levee during a flood, which also can be non-trivial. But to be a line on the map, it has to be certified, but everything else was essentially erased from the model. It wasn't, we had a with levee run and we had a without levee run, because you kind of have to look at, we don't know where it's going to fail, but we have to assume if it's not certified, we have to assume it can fail. So we used to do a with levee and a without levee run. So the with levee run was used between the levees or on the river side of the levee, and the without levee run was used to map the floodplain as if this levee could fail. That was determined, there was a request by Congress to Administrator Fugate, who is the head of FEMA, to reassess that process. And so we now have a much more detailed methodology for examining how levees could fail. Bear in mind, if it's not certified, we still have to assume that it can fail in some way. And this doesn't get into the fact that a certified levee could also fail. But, so certifying isn't a guarantee it won't fail, it's just a certification that was designed to meet FEMA standards. So just to keep that perspective. But the LAMP process offers us, it used to be white or black. It was either certified or non-certified, with levee, without levee. We now have more shades of gray. We have different ways of analyzing the levee failure mechanism, and we can fine-tune that to meet the circumstances of the river, the levee, and the community, based on what makes sense from a scientific basis. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of what those options are. But essentially what you're looking at, river side of the levee, land side of the levee. Natural valley is what the floodplain would look like without the levee in place at all. And so that's always something that we want to consider. That would be, if the levee weren't there, if nobody were here, the natural valley is what the floodplain would look like. And that's still an option. It's very similar to the without levee analysis. The other options are things like overtopping or levee breach, or there's possibilities to certify a levee in pieces. You could have a certified portion that tied into a non-certified portion, or you could have a certified portion essentially that's mostly certified except for freeboard. There's ways to get partial credit. We weren't able to restudy these levees at this time. So what we've done, instead of restudying the levee to meet the new LAMP procedure, is we're essentially secluding these areas. So this is delaying that process until this levees can be restudied to meet LAMP. This is a county-wide study. There's coastal, there's riverine, there's a lot of updated data that needs to be updated that can't wait for new funding and new analysis. The new LAMP procedure is very different and much more complicated than what had previously been an option. So essentially the seclusion boxes, and I will get into some discussion on what was secluded, is regardless of what new study was done on these rivers, if internal to the seclusion area, the effective map is not changing. So, just terminology, the effective map is the current maps that's being used for regulation. These are the prelim maps I'm talking about here. They go prelim for a while. I'll get into the schedule in a minute, but these will become effective at some point, but essentially those areas don't change. So you see the seclusion box and the little arrows or the little triangles point internal to the box of the area. With the triangles on that side is where the mapping will not be changing. So inside the seclusion area is no change. Outside the seclusion area will be the new analysis. So typically when you do a mapping update, you need to make sure that all these things tie in smoothly together so that there's no big disjointed jumps in water surface elevation, because we know water doesn't do that. We're not going to have that in seclusion areas. These are totally different studies. Current effective is not going to match the new analysis, so you will have a big difference right at the seclusion boundary. There was a lot of care put into where these seclusion boxes are located, and a part of that is what they had to be very clear on what a levee is. So again, it had to be designed as a flood control structure, so designed to withstand a flood, not just a pile of dirt. It had to have an owner, it had to have an operator, it had to have an operation plan. These are all criteria, and then it had to be hydraulically significant. So you can imagine there could be a levee that could give you very good protection at a more frequent flood event, like a 10 or 25-year flood, but then is 12 feet underwater for that 100-year event, the 1% annual chance. So how you analyze the levee, failed or not failed, could have no impact on that water surface elevation. So if it's not hydraulically significant, there could be a levee there and it's not part of the seclusion area. So bear that in mind if you're looking at the specific locations of the seclusion areas. Then the other levee feature is what we call provisionally accredited levee. So this applies to the startup levee, which is just upstream of here. That is a levee that we are fairly confident can be certified, so we're not going to, in that case, FEMA has issued a POW, and so it will be shown on the map as showing protection. The levee will need to be certified still, just like any map on the map showing, any levee on the map showing protection needs to be certified. So this POW will be in place for 2 years, and then hopefully within that time we can get the levee certified and just remove the POW note. There'll be a note on the map saying this protection is based on a provisionally accredited levee status, and hopefully that status goes off and the risk doesn't change. If the levee isn't certified, then that risk could change as a result. So that's what the PAL is, and that only applies to the startup levee. And I'll show some maps. There's not a whole lot of resolution to these, but and these are the 4 levee areas that were now analyzed for seclusion. Area 1 is the Snohomish River, the lower Snohomish River. Area 2 is the startup area and part of Sultan, sort of right near us here. Area 3 is down in the south toward the King County line, that's North Creek. And Area 4 is the lower Stillaguamish. Both the lower Snohomish and the lower Stillaguamish is of the very flat sort of, there's a lot of wetlands, a lot of just very flat areas down there, and lots of levees. It makes it complicated to assess the individual impacts of each levee, because they all are connected to each other and impact each other. And again, these maps aren't very detailed, but if you can see where there's cross-hatching, those are the areas that are determined to be hydraulically significant and connected to these levees, and those areas are not changing as part of this mapping update. So those maps stay as they are on the effective. And I know this isn't enough detail, but hopefully, if you're looking at a specific area of concern, the property ID table in the back can show you that, or we have a few places that we can get into the details on these maps. Here is the startup levee, and we have the PAL is mostly this section that runs due east-west, but the training levee that comes down to the south is hydraulically significant and is part of the seclusion area. There were some modifications in this area after the preliminary release, so please do, if you saw any mapping right at the preliminary release, please make sure that you're checking, especially this area, to make sure that you're aware of what updates are being made. There were a few tweaks and some pretty substantial changes that came from some modifications to this, the seclusion boundary determination. This is the North Creek levee. Again, it's just this overbank area that's behind this non-certified levee that is now being secluded since the LAMP analysis has not been performed yet. And again, the lower Skykomish. And every red line in this map is a levee. But the upper area is not, the levee isn't as hydraulically significant, so you can see the cross-hatching is mostly in the downstream portion, and that's where the seclusion is. Let me go through the coastal even more quickly, unless anyone is really curious about that. We did a very detailed coastal analysis. FEMA was charged with restudying the entire populated coastline of the U.S. funded by fiscal year 2014. So there's been a massive push to update all of the coastal flood insurance special flood hazard areas for the entire country. That includes the Puget Sound, that includes the Great Lakes as coastal. So the main change, the main difference is previously most of the populated coastline was Gulf Coast and Atlantic Coast, and that's where we had the best experience with wave action and how to protect from wave action, what the risk was. We don't have hurricanes on the Pacific Coast, and we have a much different landform and topography. We don't have these barrier islands and long sand dunes and low gradual shores. We have rocky, abrupt shores. It's a very different flooding hazard on the Pacific Coast, and we finally, as of 2005, have a Pacific Coast guidelines for how to do risk assessments on the Pacific Coast. So that was the most important change, but add to that much better topography everywhere, and the coastal maps are much more defensible, much more accurate now. But again, we have offshore the bathymetry, the underwater topography, the onshore topography. We have wind speeds up and down the coast, and then aerial imagery, field reconnaissance. They physically went by boat, went on foot to examine the coastline and make sure they were representing the coastline accurately. State of Washington has photos available for the entire coastline for the most part, so you can look at and see what's there, and I'll get into a little bit of how that was done, but we do the offshore calculation, then we bring those waves onshore, and what it physically runs into on the coastline is very important to how that wave behaves and what the base flood elevation is and what kind of zone you end up with on the wave. So the black lines on this map are the transects. Those are the individual locations where the coastal flood hazard is assessed. And this is what we're looking at. So we're calculating the driving forces, the wind, the pressure gradients, the tides, everything that's pushing water onshore, and then what it does in the near shore, and then how that wave ends up breaking or running up onto land. And so this is the combination of data, is the tides, the wind, the pressure, the bathymetry, and that leads you to still water elevations. And from the still water elevations, we have a model that covers the entire Puget Sound and up into the Salish Sea and to Canada, just to capture the entire picture of what's happening in this massive inland water body that we have, and how that ties to the driving forces of the tides out at the ocean. But then, you know, we have the predicted tide levels, but the predicted tide level can vary from what's been predicted based on storms and storm surge. So we're modeling now the pressure gradient changes, the wind speeds, and then comparing our model results with the observed tide gauges and trying to match them as closely as we can. And that's what this represents. The blue line, I think, is observed and the red line is modeled. So you can see as the model progresses, we match it very closely. And so we're showing that our pressure and our wind and our driving forces in the model are matching what that's doing to the water along the shoreline. If you have a low pressure system move across the Puget Sound, there's physically a little mound of water that follows that low pressure system, and that's where that's the beginning of that storm surge. So we have a massive offshore model called SWAN that takes the ADCIRC data and then routes that through the bathymetry, and we look at the 150 highest water levels over the period of record. That was 1959 to 2010, and then we're doing our statistical analysis on those events. So and then we have the offshore wave scenario and then still water elevation, and then we're running that up the coastline. And so there's three basic ways, or three different equations that we're using to run it up the coastline. The first is a very mild sloping beach. And so on you can imagine the impact on the floodplain is this floodplain will go inland further because there's nothing in the way, but the wave is not going to be as large. So mild sloping beaches, there's a more abrupt bluff, and so there it's not going to go inland as far, but it will go much, much higher. And there's another slight variation on that that has to do with a berm at the base of that bluff. So this is essentially the final modeling, and what you end up with is another zone called the V zone, the velocity zone. If you're in an area that can be hit by waves that are greater than 3 feet, then that obviously is a much greater risk. It's a somewhat arbitrary cutoff at 3 feet, but because a 2.5 foot wave could obviously still damage your home. But we're stopping the V zone. The VE zone is a detailed V zone, a V zone with a base flood elevation. We're stopping that at greater than 3 feet, and then you'll have an inland, a coastal AE zone, which is less than 3 feet. And then inland of that, you'll have the riverine AE zone. So that's how the coastal maps are drawn. In many cases, because our shoreline is so abrupt and so steep, the V zone ends in a crashing wave on the beach. So the V zone just ends at the beach. There is no A zone inland of that. Again, the preliminary maps, the table at the back can show you exactly what's before and what's after and how it's changing, but the prelim maps, anyway. Let me know if you have any questions on that. There's also, if you're curious about the coastal details, there is more information available online. Like I said, this is nationwide. They're doing updates on coastal risks, so there's been a lot of questions and a lot of impacts, as you can imagine. So the ultimate goal of all this is to provide communities, cities with long-range planning to help reduce building at risk. So we're trying to reduce risk to life and property. We're trying to be as accurate as possible from what we know about the risk. Flooding is the most predictable of the natural hazards. We know what's happened in the past, and we're only using the period of record to determine the risk going forward. So this is all based on historic values and historic observed flood events for the most part. Again, so we are at preliminary. There's a whole series of due process steps that have to happen before this maps become effective. And that's a bit of what we're showing here. And many of these dates are a good guess because there could be new things that slow things down here or there, but this is generally what we expect. So here we are, December 12th, open house. We had an open house 2 weeks ago in Everett. We had a CCO meeting which rolled it out to the communities in September. The prelims were issued in July, and the draft maps were released about 2 years prior to that. So it's a very long process, but going forward, there will be an appeal period where there are comment forms sort of scattered throughout the room. There's an opportunity to comment and appeal on these maps. Again, we want them to be as accurate as possible. If you see things on the maps that don't make sense, we would like to know about it. But just bear in mind, in order for us to make a change to the base flood elevation or the flood inundation limits, we need scientific data to back that up. We need to show that the data we're using is not accurate, or there's a better methodology, or there's better data. If you have better topography on your property, that is the kind of thing that could have an impact. But just bear in mind that we go back to the scientific justification for this, and but again, we want it to be as accurate as possible. So the appeal period should start January, February-ish. It's a 90-day appeal period. We're hoping all comments and appeals are collected within that appeal period. Appeals are generally resolved. If there is a whole other process. I think there's a slide about it, but if you do submit a technical appeal, and again, it's a high bar for technical appeal. It has to be new science, new mapping, new modeling. You have to show us what the map should look like. If it's not resolved to the community's satisfaction, and again, the community is a participating member in the National Flood Insurance Program, so it has to be submitted through your community. There is a third-party scientific review panel option available to folks if you disagree with FEMA's determination. But hopefully we can resolve all of that relatively quickly, and we're hoping to issue a letter of final determination around the fall of 2017, so in a little less than a year. LFD, letter of final determination, is the indication that everything is set, or as set as it's going to be, and that initiates the 6-month adoption period. So the cities, the county, have 6 months to formally adopt the new maps in their ordinance, and then the maps go effective somewhere around spring 2018. So again, everything you're seeing on these maps, the first time it could be effective, and the basis for determining flood insurance and flood insurance rates is spring of 2018. So again, appeals and comments, they should be bundled and given to the community in which you live. And the community doesn't have to agree with it. They don't have to. They just need to be aware of it. That's why it's submitted through them. They don't edit them, and they don't limit them. They pass them directly to FEMA, who gives them to us, and we incorporate them as best we can. So there are comment forms in the room. There's some here on this table if you have specific comments. Otherwise, you have until the end of the appeal period to submit that to your community. There's always a way to change these maps, though. Again, we want the maps to be as accurate as possible. There's the letter of map amendment, which doesn't physically change the map, but does give you a letter from FEMA saying the property is not in the floodplain. So it could be shown geographically internal to the floodplain on the map, but if you can show that your elevation is higher than that floodplain, you can show that the water can't physically get to you. So that's what a letter of map amendment shows. There is no charge from FEMA for determining that, but you do have to submit certified survey. So obviously there'd be a cost associated with a surveyor. Letter of map revision is a more detailed way of changing these maps. That's a new flood study. And that's usually submitted by an engineer, and that would physically redraw the floodplain limits. But again, these are ways of affecting these maps, of correcting these maps outside of the appeal period. So these options are always available. Don't feel like you are limited by the appeal period in order to make these kinds of changes.